Hi, everybody. I'm Greg Murray. I'm the Director of Life Planning at Vistamar School in El Segundo, California, and the Chair of the Data Trends and Analytics Committee. Welcome back to another episode of DTA Today. We're excited to discuss our wondering Scales Unveiled, Navigating the Universe of Differentiated GPAs. This afternoon, we hope to delve into the diverse grading systems from weighted 4.0 scales to unweighted 100-point scales and narrative reports showcasing student accomplishments. We hope you'll gain insights into how colleges interpret these varied grading methods and learn practical strategies to ensure your transcripts accurately convey the unique academic nuances of your school. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Evan Hansell, our moderator for today's conversation, to introduce himself and our panels.
Great, thanks, Greg. Hello, I'm Evan Hansell. I'm a college counselor at St. Paul Academy and Summit School in St. Paul, Minnesota. Pleased to be here today. I'm also pleased to welcome our panelists and share some information about them. Before I dive into that, just a few reminders. Today's session is being recorded and will be available on the Access member website following the presentation. We try to save a bit of time at the end of our sessions to address questions from members, so please make use of the Q&A feature as we go along. Also, as I begin going through the panelist bios, this webinar is about grading scales, and we all know that there are a lot of them. So as we're going through the introductions, if you wouldn't mind dropping in the grading scale that your school uses into the chat, just so that we can get a sense of just how many are being used out there, that would be wonderful. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to turn to our panelists and introduce them. First, we have Ross Bronfenbrenner from Macalester College. Ross serves as the Senior Associate Director of Admission and Athletics Liaison at Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. A Macalester alumnus, Ross recruits students from the West Coast, supports student athletes in the admission process, and helps schedule and oversee Macalester's application reading process. We're also joined by Dan Raffety from the Putney School. Dan is in his first year as Director of College Counseling at Putney. Previously, he worked at Elgin Academy in the Chicago suburbs, where he served as Director of College Counseling and Chair of the History Department. Prior to that, he was the college counselor and junior humanities teacher at Only Friends School in Barnesville, Ohio, and taught U.S. history at the Link Community School in Newark, New Jersey. Next, we have Sarah Morales from Cambridge School of Weston. Sarah is the Director of College Counseling at the Cambridge School of Weston, a small progressive independent school just outside of Boston in Weston, Massachusetts. Sarah started her career in college admissions, working at 2 different institutions in the greater Boston area before switching sides of the desk 8 years ago. And finally, we have David Graves from the University of Georgia. David has been in admissions for 33 years, 7 with a small private college and 26 with UGA. He has run the gamut of admission responsibilities, starting with traveling and file reading as a new counselor, working on publications, overseeing the review of both freshman and transfer files, and now as director. So thank you all. Thank you to the panelists for joining us today. We have a number of preset questions that we will try and go through. So the first one I'm going to direct towards Sarah and Dan, the 2 representatives of the high school side. If you could both share what grading scale or system your school uses, and how did your school settle on the scale that you use today?
I'll start first, I guess. So first of all, I should say that Putney is a very unique school, progressive education. And while we do have a grading scale, kind of a fairly traditional grading scale of A to E, we use E instead of an F, but an E does designate a failing grade. We emphasize narratives as the key to students understanding their performance. And in fact, students are not able to see their grades until after their first trimester of junior year. So freshmen and sophomores and first trimester juniors actually do not see letter grades until they're actually meeting with me. Part of the college counseling process is sharing their grades with them. But we do use for that a fairly traditional, again, A through E grading scale. And as was mentioned, this is my first year at Putney, so I'm not entirely sure how long this scale has been used, but my sense is that it's been with us for quite a while.
So at CSW, similar to Putney, we're a progressive institution. And so while we do have sort of traditional grades, same thing, sort of an A through F system, CSW does not calculate like an overall GPA that is available to students either, in our online system or on students' transcripts. But as we meet with students, particularly in junior year, the end of junior year, and we're talking about sort of grades and using that data, we're typically talking about an unweighted, we don't have honors or AP classes or anything like that. So it's a very sort of standardized, 4.0 unweighted scale that we use sort of internally. And same thing, the scale has been around, I think, for a very long time. That policy of not calculating a GPA is sort of, again, part of our mission and our focus on critical thinking and sort of investment in learning as a whole, and a sort of de-emphasis on the grades themselves.
And that's actually the same at Putney, that we don't calculate a GPA on the transcript, although we do calculate a GPA for Naviance and for Common App and things like that. But there's not actually a GPA listed on the transcript. But if there was, it'd be a pretty standard 4.0 GPA.
Well, thank you both, and thank you, Dan, for mentioning transcript, and Sarah for mentioning transcript, because that actually leads into kind of the next series of questions. This next one is for Ross and David. What types and sources of information are most useful when you are trying to evaluate a student's academic performance? We know about transcripts, but where else might you look, and what's most helpful in that search?
I'll go first since I saw Ross sort of hand it to me, I think. So, hi, everybody. David Graves again with UGA. Well, one thing I do think is, of course, with a school profile, it can help us. I know that a school profile has to serve two audiences, maybe even more than that, but two primary ones are, of course, a university admissions office, and then, of course, parents as well. And sometimes it's not the same information. And so, but the key is, if we're able to understand, for instance, we received 43,000 plus applications this year. Others have received a lot more at times. Some will have less, but that it's about timing and about making sure we do strong reviews and get through them. And so we want to make sure, if we're looking at a profile, that it's not going to be a 16-page profile or even 12-page sometimes. Make sure that when it says here's academics, that we're able to capture that quickly and see it and say, here's what it is. Definitely it helps us, especially with independent schools, if we're able to get a sense of from the counselor or from the school, as far as if you have a unique system. And I was amazed by the number of different grading scales and other things on the chat that you're able to relay to us how competitive an individual student's curriculum is overall compared to what is expected within your student body. So we're not having to guess or make a bad assumption. And you mentioned the transcript. Probably the person in our office who read the most read 3,000 files this year. That's a lot. And so anytime you can highlight certain academic things on a transcript, I talked with a group 2-3 weeks ago, and I said, I've got Scarsdale up in New York, as far as Scarsdale High School, that bolded any classes that were advanced level, or there's a private school up in Massachusetts where they highlight it. So visually, it is a visual game for us many times. So that transcript, anything you can do to visually help us as well, that really can assist us. Now I'll trade it off to Ross. So.
Hi, everybody. I agreed with all of that and kind of co-signing. I think to delve into some kind of more non-tangible factors, obviously, we're looking for, if you've got a chart that's front and center and bolded and highlighted, there's no such thing as too direct when you're telling me how to read a transcript. I'll take whatever system. I think the two more conceptual things that come to mind, which David alluded to, one of which is trust is a source of information. If you tell me a curriculum is most demanding, I believe you. If you tell me it's very demanding, if you tell me it's average, I believe you, right? I will trust but verify, right? I will look at historical data. If you tell me most demanding, and I just read an app from your school that had a significantly more, we're going to dabble in that. But I think part of that is trust, as David's talking about, not only volume, but efficiency, right? Of being able to get through those. There are data points that I have to take and say, okay, I'm going to anchor around trusting your description of this curriculum, this scale, and where this student falls as I kind of navigate through this. The other one I think is institutional knowledge. I represent a small selective residential liberal arts college, and one of the things we pride ourselves on is data integrity, which I know is sometimes not the most exciting topic of all time, but I think it can be. And if I were to take over a new territory at Macalester, we would have hundreds of high schools with descriptions of their curricula already in our CRM, descriptions of their grading scale, descriptions of their weighting scale. And so I think on profiles or on transcripts, what's particularly helpful information for me, which was alluded to earlier too, is a change. We no longer weight honors, bolded, italicized, underlined, right? Advanced is our new AP equivalent and is weighted and viewed the same. Amazing, because we can go right and put that in our context. And I'm always grateful to my colleagues on the other side of the desk who provide that information, and my colleagues who are right next to me right now who are updating that in our system as well. So I think the trust and the institutional knowledge also more conceptually can help us out.
With that conversation about transcripts and profiles and information being in multiple places, also the reference to efficiency, the next question is for Sarah and Dan. Do you have the same academic as far as grading scales or evaluation information? Maybe not the list of all available courses, but do you have the same information in both places, or is some information in one location and some information in the other? And from the last two examples, I'll now start just by asking one of you to go first. So Sarah, if you could maybe go first with this question.
So at Cambridge School of Weston, our transcript is quite long due to the nature we operate on a mod system. Students take 3 courses every 6 weeks. So students are going to have 18 plus courses on their transcript, right? So that just takes up a lot of real estate. And so we centralize sort of all of the information and data about our curriculum, about our programs, both academic and co-curricular on our profile, which admittedly is fairly robust. But we think that it's sort of helpful to have all of that information in one place so that, right, people aren't having to sort of navigate from multiple documents to find what they need. All the grades, courses on the transcript, and all the sort of extra information to better understand how to review the transcript lives on our profile.
It's basically exactly the same at Putney. We have a transcript that covers a lot of ground with outside activities, with our workshop program, with our art program. And our grading scale is just listed on the school profile, as well as some other information about the academic program, because there's a lot of work that the transcript has to do.
Yes, as a follow-up to that, for Ross and David, is there information that you feel is often found on the profile, which would actually be more helpful to if it were on the transcript, just from an efficiency standpoint? Or is there information that you often find relayed on the transcript that you feel if you just have it in the profile, that's good enough for us, we don't need it on every transcript? Ross, I don't know if you could go first answering that question.
Yeah, I think the thing that comes to mind is changes in terminology, changes in offering, changes in scale. That cannot be mentioned frequently enough, right? I think that could be kind of done to the point of redundancy. It's on the transcript and the profile, and I've seen folks footnoted at the bottom of a letter to note in 2023, 2024, these courses have been removed, right? I think that can kind of exist in as many places as possible. But I got 2 monitors in front of me right now, and to start a read, transcripts here and profiles here. So as long as it's communicated clearly and efficiently and in the way you want it to be, we're going to find it. I think just anything that might have differed is the one thing I think that could go anywhere and everywhere.
And for me, I think there's a couple of things. One, I've seen a shift a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit, where a transcript suddenly becomes a transcript and a resume. And I don't have a problem with that. I mean, photograph and, activity, all that. But probably I would say a transcript should focus primarily on just the academic information, especially for your students that we're dealing with. Most of them say, hey, parents are both well-educated. They know how to complete the application. They might already have another resume. I'd rather that if, there is space on that transcript, give us more academic information. Definitely a grading scale. It sounds silly, but a grading scale is key if I'm having to recalculate it. And if you're an IB school and I don't know if your 7 and 6 are an A and then the 5, whatever it might be, just giving it so we can say, I understand it. And it's not that I can't look in the profile, but even sometimes the profile gets confusing as far as where to find it. So anything that has to do with the grade details and how it weights, that is key to just be right on that transcript so that we can say, I understand right away. And again, nothing bad about certain things being on there. It's just if it takes up space that you could be used by something else that can help me, that'd be great, because I already have a process for looking at resumes and looking at other things that I don't need it to overtake other parts.
So going back to the two of you, David and Ross, and talking about the scales, but also grading charts. And David, you had mentioned recalculating. For schools that use A through F grades or A through E grades or non-numeric grading systems, are accompanying numeric grading charts helpful? So an A equals 100 to 93, or an A equals 95 to 93, and an A plus is a 96 and above. Are those types of charts helpful, and do they affect the reading process if they are or are not present for those types of grading scales?
I can jump in. We've got our little nod gesture down here. Short answer, I think they are helpful. The degree to which they will affect or radically shape a review of a transcript, I would hesitate to throw out there, but I think a quick correlation chart, as David alluded to, on the transcript itself, as physically proximate to the actual grades that are on there, can just be a helpful reminder of, where tiers might fall in a certain institution. I don't necessarily read a ton of transcripts where a lot of the grades are bordering on the D, E, and F, but if it is, or even on that B to C line, it is important to find that distinction. Not absolutely crucial, but I think just gives us more context, which we're oftentimes going to use to advocate rather than argue against, right? We can argue, that one actually may be in a tier higher than you thought it might be. So I wouldn't view that scale as something that will only be reflected in a negative lens. I think it can be used to contextualize in a neutral or even positive way too.
And I agree with Ross, and it doesn't hurt. Although, no, if it's an A through AE or A through F, and if there's plus minuses in there, we could already assume we know roughly where things fall. And so for that, it's not as important to where if it's numerical gets into the weird world sometimes. Many schools have such different variations on, again, what a D is. Do we even have a D? Is a D a magical 70 and that's it? I don't know how you hit exact 70 but we won't go there. 70 to 73, all the way to just the 60s. It's when it's, and again, I don't see a lot of Ds, but, it does help to understand certain things. Or if it's an unusual grading system, that's when it really can help. again, 93 to 100, 85 to, that sort of thing is where that assists a little bit. But most of the time, I'm going to say, if you gave them an A or an A minus, a B plus, I trust that and I understand it pretty easily. A letter grade is easy. It's when you get into numeric, it gets a little weirder. So.
Okay, so I'm going to jump down a little bit to some of the other questions that we had, just because I think both Sarah and Dan, you sort of addressed this, that your schools have had your grading scales for quite a while, which is great to know. One of the questions that came up in a previous conversation was about student assessments. So the transcript is really about conveying student performance over time. And one question that was raised is, what is the lowest grade a student can get on an assessment? Is it a 0? Is it a 50%? Is it whatever that number is that's a failing grade on the grading scale? And so the question that I posed to you two is that a conversation that has come up within your schools? And is that something that you've ever discussed, how to convey that type of information on a transcript? And Dan, I'll start with you if you don't mind. This
Sure.
question.
Sure. We have not had this conversation at Putney. However, I've worked at other schools previously, where there was a discussion about not giving a 0 as a failing grade, but moving that up to a 50% or, just below the sort of F or into the F threshold. And as a teacher, I employed that for a while when I was teaching history classes, where instead of giving a student a 0 on an assessment, I'd give them something between like a 40 and a high 50, just so that it wouldn't absolutely destroy their grade. So I personally have done that, but to my knowledge, there has not really been discussions of that thus far this year.
And I would say at CSW, I think there have been sort of broader conversations more around like how we grade and rubrics and sort of consistency. But for us, 60 is the lowest passing grade students can achieve. So, to Dan, your point, like in terms of their daily assessments, like students can, like if you don't turn in an assignment, you get a 0 and that impacts your overall grade. But when, we're sort of doing final grades, 60 below a 60 constitutes an F for us and a loss of credit for that class. And like I said, I think that's been the case for a long time, and I don't foresee that changing for us sort of anytime in the near future, for consistency's sake mostly.
Okay, so the next question that I have is for Ross and David. From the college side of the process, have you noticed or been part of any discussions regarding trends in the use of certain types of scales or formats? So for example, large groups of schools shifting from unweighted to weighted or from weighted back to unweighted. Have you seen that or heard of that being a topic of discussion in your work? And Ross, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think my lens is pretty particular with a small liberal arts college and a reading territory that exists in one time zone. One conversation that I've been a part of, which I'm seeing as an increasingly popular and accessible route for students and therefore more frequent on transcripts, is conversations around weighting or lack thereof for dual enroll courses. I read for Washington State, so running START here in Minnesota, the PSEO, the CIS, right? And how individual readers might grapple with that. As an example, I read a student this year whose AP Calculus course was weighted, but their dual enroll linear algebra wasn't. And that's linear algebra, right? That's 3 levels higher than any math course I've ever taken. And they got an A in that class and got a 4, and an A in Calc and got a 4.3. And so we've had some conversations about that, especially as students are more increasingly given access to opportunities like this and are looking to jumpstart, kickstart their process, how might we internally be giving them the credit they deserve for challenging themselves with college level courses? I don't have a silver bullet answer there, but that's kind of been a conversation I've been in more frequently over the past year or two.
And one thing that I'm seeing a little bit more, and I think it started in Georgia, so I apologize to everybody. But I think it spread first to Tennessee. Now I've seen it more in New York and New Jersey a little bit, is there are certain schools who are taking the teacher grade and actually adding weight to the individual teacher grade. And so suddenly a 95 becomes, I don't know, could be a 98, 105, 103, depending upon whatever weight is given. I think the largest I ever saw was 20 points given for an IB class. They quickly pulled that because they figured they understood. But that causes that's something that I'm seeing more. It causes me challenges because we recalculate our own GPA. And if you're already adding weight, what do I do? But it's also just different. And sometimes different is good, but if you're looking at consistency, different is a challenge. And that is an unusual situation. I hope it starts to not grow, it starts to recede, but that's when I'm starting to see a little bit more. I'm starting to see a little bit more. And this actually, I'm happy with it because it'll fit the school, is a few more schools, of course, are pulling out of AP or all AP and shifting to say, hey, we just have our own methodology, but making sure that you let us know the classes that will be what you would consider to be AP. If you can highlight those or bold them or something, use the word advanced and be consistent. Anything that we can consistently understand, especially if it's unique, that helps us. Again, just because we're dealing, Ross, you're probably dealing with 3,000-4,000 high schools, and you want to make sure you're doing the best, but it means we've got to have that information on hand. So.
Okay, so this next sort of series of questions is for everyone. It is the subject of grade inflation. So for those of you, yeah, exactly. For those of you on the high school side, have your institutions discussed grade inflation to any capacity, or thought about the impacts of the conversation regarding grade inflation?
I can.
Yeah, Sarah, I'll start
Want me to start?
Thanks.
So we definitely have had some, I would not say necessarily like high level conversations yet, but I think there are a lot of sort of smaller conversations happening, post COVID, about grade inflation in general. And I think they're happening at CSW from the lens again of equity and sort of grading fairly across, all of our courses. So like we at CSW might have a class that's taught at different times of a year by two different teachers, right? And we want those rubrics and those grading scales to look similar and sort of, again, be reflective of the course content that's being taught and not reflective of different teachers' expectations and sort of their own grading scales. And so I think sort of as a byproduct of that, sort of getting everyone on the same page will sort of help address some of the grade inflation that I think, we see like everybody else is sort of seeing right now. But that's been, I think, an interesting lens to approach it from of sort of consistency across, different departments, different disciplines, and then hopefully eventually sort of across our school community in the academic spaces. But yeah, it's definitely something I think people are aware of and sort of know has trickled in the post-COVID world, especially. So, thinking critically about how do we still allow teachers to have autonomy in running their classes and in their grading, but also, right, helping colleges understand like this is what an A means here at CSW, sort of thing.
I'd say it's a similar answer at Putney. It comes up a fair bit at program director meetings. We definitely discuss it, although there, to my knowledge, has not been any sort of resolution or there's not been a campus-wide chat to my knowledge between all the departments about it. But it is definitely something that the administration is mindful of, and does come up quite a bit at meetings. And it's definitely something that I know from my previous school and from having had discussions with other colleagues. I mean, it's something that goes on frequently. And yeah, obviously COVID played a huge role in making it much more likely for kids to get A's and high B's and things like that. Um, but yeah, I wish I could say there was a a resolution in place or a plan in place. But again, as Sarah said, it's complicated as different teachers have different styles, have different expectations. And while you can certainly make standardized rubrics, people can still interpret those rubrics as they will. Speaking as somebody who taught AP US history for years and years and years. Um, so yeah, again, discussed, yes. Resolved, no.
For our college colleagues, on the subject of grade inflation, have you noticed it impacting certain types of grading scales more or less? Thinking about things like narrative reports, the exact grade inflation might not impact something like that as much as numeric scales or A to F scales. Have either of you noticed it taking place more in certain types of formats than others? And David, I'll start with you.
Sounds good. I think, and we have to deal with it as well as far as the idea of grade inflation at institutions, at colleges as well. It's always discussed, but two things I think are a challenge. In that, one, I think it's always sort of that not in my backyard. So it's out there, but it's everybody else, not us. Unfortunately, that is the case and I don't really think that I don't see as much as people expect me to see. I mean, if you look at students who went through, they're applying right now. It's the seniors right now. They had freshman year COVID challenges out the wazoo. I mean, and you did see some lower grades. It wasn't just whitewashed of, everybody's going to get A's and B's and all that. We really have taken into account situations where we know it was challenging. So how did they progress? I think it's also a challenge, again, in the media narrative and with College Board and ACT drive the narrative of grade inflation to say, hey, use our test. And this is coming from someone who my institution requires the SAT or ACT. It's not my choice. It's just the state choice, but they drive the narrative of grade inflation, but their grade inflation is self-reported from the student, not the actual grades that are given in the classroom. And so I think it's out there a little bit, but it's been out there for 100 years plus almost. I've seen it. And I never think it's as bad as it really is. I think that the teachers and your teachers are doing a good job of trying to navigate challenging times and also give accurate information. So we trust this. We trust it. That's what I'll say.
Yeah, I can keep it relatively brief and co-sign there the trust that educators are using their intention to make sure really clear scales. I'm chuckling a little bit at the idea of an inflated narrative exclusive summary. It just leans a lot more on a thesaurus. I don't know how that inflates, just a lot of superlative kind of phrases. So I guess I haven't seen it there. But to answer kind of the direct question, I anecdotally haven't noticed one particular scale that seems to have shifted more dramatically. I think we're in an interesting kind of post-COVID where the do no harm style pass fail, as David noted, appears kind of in 9th grade and then starts to fade. So I'm personally curious more than anything. Once that is off of the vast majority of applicants' transcripts, are we going to start to see kind of a new trend or a reset in some way? But agreed in general that there's trust with what you give us and that it's done with intention and done with kind of purpose to make sure that it's just as accurate as it can
be. Okay, so we've kind of gone through the questions that we had prepared ahead of time, but we do have at least one question in the Q&A, and again, we invite others with questions for any of our panelists to use the Q&A function. But I'll go to the first one that we have, which is it's from a school that does not currently report internal GPA on the transcript. And that school currently uses a 1 to 100 point scale, but they're planning to add their internal GPA to the transcript. The concern is that they only give 0.3 additional weight bump for honors and AP courses when converting to a traditional 4.0 scale. Talking to other people, if the GPA goes up and begins being higher, how do we, then what would we report with the modest weighting? Any advice for how to address this so that providing a weighted GPA doesn't hurt our students for scholarship tiers and admission at certain schools? So shifting to adding a GPA and thinking about adding a GPA with weight, any suggestions on trying to avoid hurting students that might not get that bump?
I'll just say that
it's open to.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say open to all panelists, but it seems like the question is, when the school seems to be concerned that if they start using a GPA and a weighted GPA, that if it's recalculated by colleges and universities, will that ultimately end up hurting their students in that recalculation? And any advice on how to address this?
I'll just say not at Putney, but at the school that I just came from, Elgin Academy, we had honors and AP courses and they were not weighted. Everything was on a 4.3 scale, regardless of whether it was AP honors or a regular class. And that did not seem to have any ill effect on students' opportunities for scholarships. I think colleges were able to read between the lines, and if they wanted to add their own weight to an AP course, or if they wanted to add their own weight to an honors course, they could do that. But I don't think adding a weight or taking a weight away, I don't think that that's necessarily going to have a big impact on scholarships.
From UGA's focus, I think that if it is an institution, a college that dives deep into the reviews, if they're doing the holistic review, Ross, you're probably doing holistic reviews on everybody, etc. I don't think it will have an impact, but I think on a certain tier it might. And if you're looking at, and I don't want to pick on any others, but there are certain schools in the SEC that say this GPA, this test score, etc. Here's a scholarship. I think it could have a slight impact. And what I generally suggest is, and universities do this a lot, is you look at your peer or aspirational schools and say, what are they doing? Do we need to sort of maybe find a way to be similar in how we relate information? And so if you looked at some of your peer high schools, other independent high schools, and say, how are they adding weight? So that you're not trying to trick things or anything else. It's just you're saying, I'm trying to go within a system that might be very similar to everybody else's, what they're doing for the most part. I think that might be intelligent. I'm not saying do it, you have to, but it's just that there are certain institutions that will just say, let me grab that GPA, whatever it is, unless it says we don't weight. That's totally different. But if you add weight and then you're just tiny little adding of weight, maybe you should say, how does everybody else do it? Just so we can be on the same level playing field.
Okay, thank you. So we have two other questions. One is about sort of a change within a specific school, or a potential change within a specific school of a grading scale. So the school currently has a non-traditional numeric and letter scale where, for example, a 90 to a 92 is actually a B+, where I think typically that would be more of an A minus. And the school is considering shifting it where those numbers and letters align more with a traditional 90 to 92 A minus scale. There are some people in the community who are concerned about the perception of rigor. A 92 just suddenly became an A minus when it was a B plus before. And then others who are concerned that having a quote harder scale actually quote hurts students. I'm wondering if anybody has had those types of conversations, or if that is something from the college side that would be easy to assess, just given the information that would be on transcript or profile. Yeah, so if anybody could speak to context related to that.
Well, I'll just chime in. I probably won't answer the question directly. Maybe Ross or David will have a better answer, but I can share a few years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we changed our curriculum structure and we went from 7 5-week mods to 6 6-week mods. And so what constituted like a full year of credit, like that was a big change. And so we had sort of similar conversations of like, how do we communicate this? How will colleges sort of know and juggle these, right, different sort of scales for sort of the period of time it takes to transition everybody to the new system. And again, it was something that we just spelled out very clearly in our profile for those transition years. It was something, we made sure we educated students on, that we educated college reps on when they would visit us. And so we just tried to be really upfront and transparent of like, this is the old scale, this is the new scale. It's so that, when colleges were reviewing our transcripts, right, it was clear, okay, these years use this scale, these years are using, this scale. And again, I think we're sort of nervous to see how that would play out. But again, overall, we had very few questions and follow-ups about it. And sort of the feedback was like, that was helpful. And as long as it's clear and articulated, well for readers, that again, they're adept at managing, transitions and different scales at different times.
Yeah, I think if it's well communicated and transparent and direct and just kind of owned, hey, we're doing this, I think on a holistic review kind of perspective, it may take a moment of transition, but we're going to hit our stride pretty quickly, once we've seen that a couple of iterations. With the question of kind of moving back to a more standard scale, to David's point about the standardization of weighting, I think the standardization of something that starts with a 9 being an A, I don't necessarily see it as some kind of negative moving back to a less difficult scale. I don't think it's out of the question to have a 90 be an A minus, and I may be projecting because I got an 89.47 in calculus once, and they don't round up an 89.47, despite many written appeals, but that's why it was calc and I didn't take stats. But I think with that scale, if it's managed in a way that Sarah was alluding to, of just kind of scaffolded and handed to folks really neatly, I don't think people in a position like mine at Mac would have any kind of concerns other than just an intentional minute at the beginning of a read to make sure I've lined this up.
And I agree. You guys covered it very well. I think Northern Virginia Publics went through this about 10 years ago, where they were battling, the same situation. And it's more for parents many times than anything else, of saying, I want to be seen as equal with others, but still recognize my strengths. And sometimes it's more of just having to placate parents than anything else, of that we're going to be on the same level playing field. And that's where I sort of step back, because I know unless they do a retroactive grading scale change, which I've seen, most of the time, everybody's very good at saying, these years it was this, these years it was this. South Carolina did an entire state grading scale change, 4 or 5 years ago. So they were very clear, and that's the real positive.
All right, and we have one more question from the audience here that we'll end on, which is, it's from a school that currently uses the practice of not having a cumulative GPA, but a year GPA for each year. And the thought behind that is that they often have students transferring in at different times in high school. And so they don't think that a cumulative GPA would capture the wide array of experiences that their students have academically. Is this something that either of you on the high school side have considered or talked about as reasons for a certain practice? And on the college side, is that type of decision helpful, or is that something that, given that you might be recalculating anyway and looking at all the transcripts that come through, might not make as much of a difference as maybe high schools think it might?
I'll just say that we have any number of students coming in as sophomores, juniors, and sometimes as seniors. And what we do is, for purpose of Naviance and Common App, we calculate a Putney GPA for them. And that could just be 2 trimesters of junior year. I'm kind of intrigued by that idea of a 1 year, a yearly GPA. I could see how that would make a lot of sense at a private school, at a boarding school where you've got students coming from all over. But yeah, it's an interesting thing because I often have students asking me, "Hey, is this my entire GPA?" And I'm like, "Well, it doesn't include, where you were freshman and sophomore year. I'm happy to help you calculate that yourself if you'd like, but that's not what's going to go into our system." But I know that's a particular challenge for boarding schools where we've got kids coming, again, all the way up through senior year with completely different transcripts, completely different systems. If they're coming into our progressive education system from an IB school or from an AP school, that's going to just look entirely different. I do the best I can to explain that in counselors' letters and help students explain that on their applications. But I do think that idea of a 1 year, a year-to-year GPA is intriguing. I'm not sure how that would look on the college side, but I think it's a very interesting idea.
Well, and I'll say, I mean, again, being at a school where we don't report a GPA on our transcript at all, right? Like that sort of eliminates any sort of issues. And yeah, we have students join us at all different points. And not only, right, we don't report a GPA on our transcript, we don't have students report a GPA on the Common App. And so again, when we're sort of working with students and counseling them and we do calculate sort of unofficial internal GPAs, we still use that information and data and sort of convert it to mimic or match how we calculate GPAs at CSW to try to, again, replicate what a college is likely going to do on their side of things. So again, yeah, like I understand the yearly, but I think not having sort of a GPA at all gives you a lot of flexibility to sort of talk with students, about the nuances of maybe different curriculums. And normally it's having to sort of navigate those complexities.
Right. Well, thank you so much to all of the panelists for spending your time here with us today and answering the questions. Thank you everyone out there for joining us. A couple announcements before we go is I just want to remind everyone that this recording will be available. So keep an eye out for an email that would link to the recording as well as on the Access website. Might also be a good moment to subscribe to the Access YouTube channel where you can find webinars and some other short videos from the Data Trends and Analytics Committee on various topics. So thank you all again for joining us. We hope that this information was helpful, and we will remain here for just a few moments as everyone signs off, but we hope you all have a good day and good decision release season in the weeks to come. Thank you.